You're listening to KZSC's Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcone. Today I'm here with Dr. Rebecca Schreiber, Associate Professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. Her research focuses on issues of migration between the United States and Mexico and considers relations to place, identity, dislocation through forms of visual culture. Her first book, Cold War Exiles in Mexico, U.S. Dissidents and the Culture of Critical Resistance, published in 2008 by the University of Minnesota Press, was about how many U.S. writers, artists, and filmmakers left the U.S. for Mexico during the Cold War of the 1940s and 1950s. I've invited her to the show to talk about her most recent book, The Undocumented Everyday, Migrant Lives and the Politics of Visibility, published in 2018 from the University of Minnesota Press. This book examines how Mexican and Central American migrants have depicted themselves and members of their communities in documentary photography, film, video, and audio projects since September 11th. Welcome, Rebecca, to KZSC's Voces Críticas.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So tell me, how did the idea for the book emerge for you, and why did you want to write this story?
This goes back to the early 2000s when I was starting to research a project called Unseen America, which was a national photography project organized by the Bread and Roses Cultural Project, the then cultural arm of SEIU 1199. They had received a donation of about 100 cameras, and so they started organizing workshops with groups of workers across New York State and within New York City, and in part because I knew about these photography workshops, I was able to attend some exhibitions of the work, and I actually started writing about some of the projects, such as one that involved day laborers in Long Island in creating photographs of their lives. As I was working on this project, I noticed that there were other similar kinds of projects being developed, and this is mostly after 9/11, where nonprofit social service organizations and advocacy groups, filmmakers, and photographers were starting to create projects specifically for Mexican and Central American migrants to represent their lives through documentary form. And so my background in part is in U.S. labor and immigration history and also in visual culture. I'm also someone who has been involved in video production and making media, and so in some ways my interest was drawn to the sort of proliferation of these kinds of projects whereby these groups or artists or filmmakers were giving cameras to immigrants to represent their lives and then to exhibit these works. And it reminded me of projects that were developed in the 1960s and 70s that were very similar. Specifically, photographers and filmmakers were giving cameras to groups of so-called marginalized people to represent their lives. I guess my big research question was, why was this strategy having a resurgence in this post-9/11 moment in projects specifically involving Mexican and Central American migrants? So then I started conducting research on these projects across the country as they were developing and as they were being exhibited.
There are so many rich layers of visual cultural representation, like you've just talked about, that you explore in this book. And I wondered, as an American Studies scholar, why was it important for you to broach the subject of migration through this visual cultural approach and with this lens of self-representation?
Part of my training in American Studies does involve an interdisciplinary methodology that relates a formal analysis of a cultural work to the context in which it was produced. In terms of self-representation, I think my focus on that was really a response to the question that I had regarding the proliferation of these projects that were developing after 9/11 that involved training Mexican and Central American migrants to use cameras to represent their lives. So again, one of my main questions was, why was this particular approach being taken up, in the early 21st century, specifically in projects that involve Mexican and Central American migrants? So the book project was a response to this question. And in order to answer it, I did put questions of visibility and self-representation at the center of U.S. immigration politics. However, one other thing that I want to add is the book is in dialogue with the work of scholars of immigration, like Amalia Pallares, who argues that it's really important for scholars to study the subjectivity and agency of undocumented people, within the context of their exclusion from citizenship. So one of the ways that I tried to address this call was through examining forms of visual culture that migrants create.
You raise some very important points in your book that one of the risks, for instance, of documentary photography or curated videos is that viewers may not fully understand or appreciate the context for what they're witnessing. And I wondered if you could talk about, are you suggesting that perhaps some of these visual projects are running the risk of compromising perhaps meaningful structural changes or societal level changes?
That's a really great question. And, I think this does relate to how the works appear in exhibitions, how they circulate, and how they're distributed, how they are curated. In the book, I do look at these issues of address as well as audiences for the projects, including how the works themselves are mediated, curated, and distributed. I also argue that the way in which these projects of self-representation are framed, say like within the context of an exhibition, can place limitations on how the work is viewed by different audiences. So to provide some more context, sometimes the organizations and individuals who coordinated these projects had goals that differed from those who created the documentary works, which entailed presenting the films or photographs or videos in specific ways for broader audiences. So, for example, some of the photography exhibitions were curated by staff members at nonprofit organizations or by members of advocacy groups who viewed these images as creating awareness among viewers from outside the community represented. These photos were framed by this sort of liberal humanist belief that the images will elicit an emotional response from the audience and that this emotion or affect will lead to some kind of reform. And I think that this framing limited how these images were viewed and thus, what impact they might have on those who saw them.
So two themes that come up throughout your book are citizenship and belonging. These are two really powerful themes in your book. And the ways in which self-representation disrupts, in many ways, this sort of natural association we make between these two thematics. Because we're talking about undocumented communities, the parts in your book where you're talking about the Minutemen, for listeners who may not remember, this Minutemen was a very racist vigilante group along the U.S.-Mexico border that targeted border crossers, whether they were actual border crossers or perceived border crossers. How dangerous was it when the U.S. federal government started referring to this group not as vigilantes, but rather as, quote, working alongside border enforcement agents?
I do write about a project called the Border Film Project, and that's one where organizers provided disposable cameras to Mexican and Central American migrants in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and to members of the Minuteman Project in order to represent what they saw as both sides of the immigration debate. As you were describing the Minutemen, the project itself emerged at the time that the Minutemen were very present on the U.S. side of the U.S.-Mexico boundary, and they were already using surveillance technologies to track undocumented migrants, and they also used cameras to survey migrants. So one of my concerns with this project had to do with this particular relationship existed previous to the development of the Border Film Project, and I think that it informs the way in which the images can be interpreted. The danger kind of associated with the U.S. federal government referring to the group not as vigilantes, but as kind of working alongside state agents, this was very dangerous. And I think that it's important to note that in 2005, during their action in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, the Minutemen received support not only from the Department of Homeland Security and the Border Patrol, but also from members of Congress, including the head of the Congressional Immigration Reform Caucus. But I also think what was dangerous was the group's influences on decisions made by the Bush administration during his second term in office. So there are other scholars like Roxanne Doty. She notes that one of the co-founders of the Minutemen Civil Defense Corps project announced that the group would build a border security fence unless the White House positioned the National Guard there. And that actually led to the Bush administration's plan to deploy 600 National Guard troops to the border.
You were listening to Dr. Rebecca Schreiber, Associate Professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. She's the author of The Undocumented Everyday, Migrant Lives, and the Politics of Visibility, published this year by the University of Minnesota Press. Rebecca, I wondered if we could talk about the kind of wide tapestry that you cover in this book, the various visual mediums that you address in this book, documentary photography, audio projects, films, and so forth. Why was it important for you to have such an expansive data set for this research to tell these particular stories?
Since my focus was on self-representation in documentary form, I really was open to what kind of form the work would take, whether it be photography, film, video, or audio projects. I think there's a lot that can be learned about the documentary form from this more expansive view. So some of the arguments that I make in the book have to do with how in these documentary projects, migrants create a mixed genre aesthetic, drawing on personal, family, and snapshot photography, as well as performative elements in film and video. So in combining documentary with family, personal, and snapshot photography, these migrants created images that were meaningful to them, which relate to a broader political project or sometimes that connected family members separated by national borders. I'll also say that the photographic work in the first half of the book differs from the film, video, and audio projects in the second half. There, the migrant sort of self-conscious use of performance adds another dimension to these latter works. These projects, which were developed in collaboration with filmmakers, artists, and activists, extend and disrupt documentary conventions through their performative and experimental elements.
Your book has a chapter about the so-called sanctuary city of San Francisco, our nearby neighbor here in Santa Cruz. And you talk about this tension between the local city ordinances and federal immigration laws. And the work of the artists that you talk about reside within this tension in this exhibit called Sanctuary City. And this was done by an artist named Sergio de la Torre. You talk about this projection as a counter-spectacle, and I wondered if you could explain what this term means to you.
This is a project that was developed starting in 2007 when a curator at the San Francisco Art Institute invited Sergio de la Torre to work with art students, community groups, and nonprofit organizations on a project about the city. De la Torre planned to collaborate not only with art students, but with young Latinx migrants affiliated with a mental health center located in the Mission District on a video project that addressed issues of safety and security for Latinx migrants in San Francisco. This emphasis was especially relevant during a time period in which there were ICE raids targeting undocumented Latinx communities in San Francisco and the Bay Area. De la Torre wanted to include these young migrants as kind of creative participants in the production of the video. He was not able to identify individuals who wanted to collaborate, in part because many were afraid to do so due to the raids. Instead of collaborating with that group of young migrants, he instead worked with these art students on an exhibition that included oral testimony given by members of undocumented Latinx communities as part of joint hearings on the ICE raids, which were organized by the Human Rights Commission and Immigrant Rights Commission in San Francisco. De la Torre created a mobile projector from which he projected text based on testimony from the hearings on the ICE raids, and he projected this at a location in the Mission District near where the raids had taken place. One of the arguments that I make in the book is that the projection of migrants' testimony onto buildings in the Mission District functions as a form of counter-spectacle to what scholar Nicholas DeGeneva calls a spectacle of security in the post-9/11 era. So the spectacle of security includes ICE raids, which, as DeGeneva notes, highlight a kind of menacing figure of so-called criminal aliens with pending arrest warrants. What I argue is that these projections counter the spectacle of security and bring attention to the forces of state power as a way to challenge state power, and specifically to make visible the effects of ICE raids raids on members of undocumented Latinx communities, which are typically unseen by the broader public. So these counter-spectacles kind of critically amplified the practices of state surveillance, and they also illuminated the sort of disjuncture between the ICE raids and racial profiling of Latinx migrants and local politicians' statements about the sanctuary ordinance. So with these projections, the artists were interspersing texts from the testimony with the statements made by politicians that made reference to the sanctuary ordinance. In other words, that the city would protect immigrants and so forth. The projections and the exhibition kind of get at the sort of disjuncture really between what's being said by politicians and what's being experienced by immigrants and members of their families.
How have the stakes of self-representation for the undocumented community become heightened now in our current political climate?
To answer that question, I think we should kind of go back to Obama's first term in office, and that's actually the conclusion of the book is 2012. It really concludes at the end of his first term. And it was really during the Obama administration that migrant activists discovered that being visible and publicizing their actions could affect policy as well as protect them from arrest, detention, and deportation. So in the lead up to the 2012 presidential election, undocumented youth activists devised strategies to make visible what the Obama administration was trying to conceal, which was immigrant detention and deportation. And these activists did this by putting their bodies on the line. You know, they held sit-ins in ICE offices. They intentionally tested policies related to prosecutorial discretion to show how undocumented people who are not a priority for immigration enforcement were in fact being detained. And a lot of this activism led to President Obama's executive order on deferred action for childhood arrivals. I do think that the stakes of self-representation and for being visible are much riskier for undocumented communities in the present moment. I'm thinking about the effects of President Trump's January 2017 executive orders to more recent policies developed by Attorney General Jeff Sessions that include the targeting of authorized immigrants within the United States. In terms of the strategies of migrant activists, since they're so dynamic and they change all the time, my sense is that there'll have to be kind of new strategies developed, and they are being developed for this current moment. But it really is a different moment with the Trump administration, than the Obama administration. At the same time, there are lots of continuities in terms of policy. But I think that, as you said, that the stakes of self-representation are really, they're different, and there's a lot more risk involved.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about your new book.
Thank you again, Silvana, for having me on the show. I've really enjoyed the discussion that we've had.